So in this particular story in the world, it's basically, a Superman and Batman type characters. The story primarily follows the Superman type hero named American Eagle. He's been uh, a quintessential American icon for over 100 years. So he has been through kind of like the development and the evolution of our country through the past century. So he's existed through Jim Crow. He's existed through the civil rights movement. And so the story starts out with a black man, an unarmed black man, being pulled over and accused of having marijuana in his car, and the American Eagle intervenes in this man being beaten. So throughout the story, he continuously tries to intervene specifically in this one man's case. He visits him in the hospital, he visits him in prison, and he kind of uses the clout that he has built from being this American icon for so long to, kind of get his way, or what he assumes should be, just something easy procedural things. And he's coming across a lot of pushback that he hadn't expected. So it he's trying to determine, and his friends intervening as well are trying to explain to him that, you know, American life is not just this box that you have been privy to. And so that's something that he is learning as the story unfolds, and he tries to decide and figure out where he should intervene, and whether or not he's actually doing more harm than good. Did I cover everything, Jamel and Wes? Anything else there we need for the discussion?
No, I think you covered it pretty well. There are just all sorts of layers in this book, in this novella, the same as with the others, but I think you covered it pretty well.
And I'm just trying to finish read so I don't get spoiled.
Sorry, it's probably gonna happen.
All right. Well, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here because then I get to see everyone else. And Jamel, I think we'll put in the chat our discussion guide, reading guide, and we'll just kind of get started. And Robin, do you want to get started with that introductory question?
Sure. So as you guys saw, the title of the story is model minority. And that term is one that is used to describe a minority group that is perceived to exemplify model behavior as defined by the dominant group. So predominantly for our American society, it would be white people. So how is this positive stereotype actually potentially harmful, and how does it reinforce the American racial caste system? And if you guys aren't familiar with the racial caste system, we can explain that a little bit. But it's not a new concept, but it was kind of made popular by Isabel Wilkerson in her book that came out a few years ago, describing how the American racial hierarchy is very similar to a caste system. Anyone have any thoughts?
This is where Wes is very good, about being silent because he's a teacher and he'll wait for people to respond. Um, I'm not quite as good at that, but I'll just say that that whole notion of model minority, what's a model, what's a minority, it just yeah, part of me even began to think that some of the story was about this one character, this one guy who was supposedly a model citizen trying to do something, and he was clearly in a minority himself. So I like I said, there are lots of layers in it, and just thinking about what you know what it means to be a model minority, how stereotypes are helpful and harmful is just something that I did a lot thinking about for this. But let's open it up to other folks. You can use your hand feature. You can use you can type in the chat as well.
So Chana added a really good point that the model minority is one that embraces the culture of the dominant race. And I think that's a really important point as well, because we know about the pressure of assimilation and how a lot of times within American culture, we sometimes other, people who are from other countries, from other cultures, to make them feel different, as if they should assimilate to American culture. See, Grant has his hand up, so I'm going to unmute you.
Hello. Yeah, one of the things you see, like the right-wing talking point about IQ that seems to be cribbed from like the bell curve book, or that kind of theory. Often it's used as an argument against systemic racism in the United States, because the argument they bring up is like high IQ scores among Asian Americans and more representation in higher ed classes, stuff like that.
Robin, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up too. And we actually have some articles in the reading guide specifically to touch on that point about, how that term is often applied to Asian Americans. So Peg, I see you have your hand up, so I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Thank you. And I would say when I read this, I kind of thought about the title as being the model minority. And I took that to really be ironic, because it captures so often a stereotype. And it was like, especially at the end, it was, a lot of different stereotypes came into play. I mean, we had the hero, the victim in the beginning, and how easily does that fall into a stereotype of today. You have police brutality, and someone is innocently walking along, and all of a sudden becomes a target based on race. But then also, this was just an innocent person who just happened to kind of be a victim of the wrong place at the wrong time, race, whatever. And then at the end, you also have the stereotype of the police officer who ultimately is completely brutal. And he just exemplifies everything negative about the police force. So just the same as not every police officer is a negative type of character like this police officer was, but so also are victims of police brutality not justly, they're unjustly targeted because of their race. And I just found this all to be so ironic. And even with the American Eagle at the end, like he just turns out to be, he's really ultimately ineffective to really kind of fix this broken system. And I think later in the discussion guide, there was a comment about the quotation on 123. So I'll end here and give someone else a chance to share, but I will come back around to 123 again in the end. So thank you very much, Robin. It just to me read as a story of complete irony.
Thank you, Peg. Anyone else have any thoughts to share? I see Susan listed in the comments that it erases the differences among individuals, and that if you don't fit into this myth, then you're going to find it hard to find your place in society. And that's a really good point. That's definitely some of the points that were expounded upon in the articles that are in the reading guide, about how these assumptions about people's behaviors and what they should and shouldn't do. And it actually kind of works in both ways, in terms of, in opposite ways, I should say, in terms of, the harm, making the assumptions that someone is always going to, get perfect math scores, be logically minded, and even, just kind of the societal norms around things like toxic masculinity, go fit into how stereotyping impacts groups of people, and how if you don't fit into those things, like Susan mentioned, you end up finding it difficult to find your place into society, because people around you kind of almost reinforce and like self-police those stereotypes by expecting you to exemplify certain behaviors, whether you want to or not. And part of the reason why I asked about it being, a part of the racial caste system, I'm not sure if many of you have heard of, kind of like the concept of colorism and other things. And there's this term that I use a lot, and I can't remember where I initially heard it, but the term is proximity to whiteness. And basically, it fits within the caste system, about how there is this sliding scale, between white and black, like they are the two binary at the ends of the scale, and how well you can mold yourself based on these stereotypes to, an ideal of what this model minority is, what the dominant group decides are model behaviors for a citizen, gets you closer access to the power of whiteness. And that's another theme too that we're going to talk about a little bit in one of the other questions. So if no one else has any other further comments on that, we'll move on to the next question.
I just put it in the chat.
Alrighty, thank you. So the story opens with a very graphic depiction of police beating a Black man. Even as far back as the civil rights movement, media and news have used very graphic depictions of violence against Black people. Why do you think that these graphic representations are deemed necessary by American media?
And I have a question about the question, Robin.
Sure.
So is it that the depictions of, is it depictions of violence against Black people, or is it use of graphic depictions of violence being used against Black people? I'm trying to make sure that I understand what the concept of use is here.
I apologize. I'm not sure I'm following your question.
So the media have used depictions of violence against Black people.
Mm-hmm.
Have they used that? I just want to make sure that you're not talking, is it media using depictions of violence against Black people?
Oh, I got you.
Yes.
So it is depictions of violence against Black people being used by the media, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that that was clear. And
gotcha.
okay.
Thank you for that clarification. Yeah. All right, Chana, you got your hand up, so I'm gonna go ahead and ask you to unmute.
Okay, it's Hannah.
Oops, my apologies, Anna. Thank you.
Well, the media's depiction of violence against people of color, Black people, is a sword that swings two ways. Because without the media's depiction of what happened on Bloody Sunday, with people crossing the Pettus Bridge and other violent actions back in the 60s, if the media had not gotten involved and shown those graphic images, the civil rights movement would not have made the progress that it made. The same thing with Rodney King when he was attacked, and George Floyd when he was murdered by the police. So if you're talking about Fox News, then they show violence against Black people to entertain their viewers because they get a thrill out of seeing that and doing it. But with most mainstream media, I mean, they do everything for ratings, but I also think that as long as they don't show so much of it that it becomes normalized, sometimes people need to see that so that they know that this isn't just something that people are saying. Before, I'm 72. So before there were cell phones and everything instantly out there, the horrors that were perpetrated against our community and things that were done to us, when we would tell people about it, they would poo-poo it and, just brush it off. But when you can see this as it's happening, when you see Orlando Castile being shot to death, just you see it, then there's no argument for it. So I think it's a good thing, and it goes both ways.
Yeah, great points there, Hannah. And Susie also added in the comments that the graphic depictions illustrate the seriousness of the situation, which kind of reinforces Hannah's point as well. But then kind of like she was saying, the duality of it is, that shock sells. And kind of like you were saying, Hannah, that was part of the whole reason, when we learn about Emmett Till and Mamie's, his mother's decision to have an open casket was for that very reason. Right. For a long time, people did not believe that white people did not believe that it was happening. They didn't believe the severity. They didn't understand the severity of the brutality. So these depictions were necessary just for people to be believed. But it's a very slippery slope because, like Susie said, you get from the point of actually depicting the seriousness of the situation to becoming gratuitous. And there are actually studies being done now that are indicating that this repeated graphic visualization of violence against Black people is physically traumatizing and can induce PTSD-like symptoms in people whom it hasn't even directly occurred to, because of just understanding that this is a potential danger that we as Black Americans face. It's still something that's very scary to see it constantly and repeatedly happening. Anyone else have any other thoughts? Okay, I'm gonna kind of skip over the third one because we did talk about this one a little bit, but as after Wilbur Robinson is beaten, he asks specifically if anyone is recording because he wants to make sure that he has video evidence of this. And the question was, how has the ease of access to recording technology changed how we talk about the treatment of Black people in public spaces, and why was this type of video evidence necessary? So we did talk about that a little bit. So unless anyone has anything to add there.
The one thing that that concerns me is that, yes, on the one hand, there's now more evidence, through recording, but is there a propensity to now say, well, if there is no recording, then there is no evidence and it did not happen, and we know that that's just not true. So it's, again, one of these double-edged swords, where it's available, but does it condition us to say, well, there's no recording, so we don't really know what the true story is,
That's
and conveniently skip over the fact that, well, there are there are certain presumptions that that you might be able to take. But anyway.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, because that is something that I've seen a lot in spaces where people would say, well, let's see the video. How do we know what really happened until we see the video? We go into it with a baseline of not believing victims when they are Black. And it kind of goes back to that racial caste system, how different things play into, people's believability, especially appearance. Things like that play into, how likely it is that someone will be believed. There's a term that I use sometimes with friends when I'm talking about like a specific work environment. We'll say that we're safe Black people, because we dress a certain way. We predominantly use American Standard English when we're speaking. We typically have, a certain look, a certain level of education, and it makes white people comfortable, and in those spaces, it makes it still difficult at times, but it makes it easier for us to navigate spaces that are typically hard for other Black people. And that's just, again, like part of that racial caste system, that part of that hierarchy, where it goes into kind of like being the model minority. There are these certain behaviors that the dominant culture has decided are ideal, and as best as we can fit into those boxes, because right, we can never remove our Black skin, but we can enunciate our words, we can dress in khakis and do other things like that that can make white people comfortable. So I see Harrison, you have a comment, so I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Hello. One thing that I would add, that I do think that the rise of recording has changed, is that it offers another narrative. I think for a lot of the white population, they were trusting full on whatever, the officials were saying, whatever police were saying happened is what happened. Seeing just blatantly and outright, and in a way that you simply cannot ignore, whether it be there have been several great examples brought up with Castile, and also, George Floyd, just watching for minutes on end. So I think it's also a matter of who's recording it and why. And I think a lot of the times when we are getting new videos, it's because people do want to hold officials accountable, but also show, look, if they're saying X, Y, and Z happened, we do have some way of checking the story.
Robin, your mic's off.
Sorry, I was just reading through the comments. Alrighty, let's go ahead and move on to the next question, unless anyone else has any other anything else that they'd like to share.
I do think what Susie, you know, put in, just with technology, not only can we record, but it's so easy now, media, to alter that narrative or alter the story into a way that fits the narrative they want to push. So while we can record, you can also create a narrative by clipping a word out, one little word out very easily, you know. And so that misinformation, disinformation is like, that's the of that double-edged sword that I believe Hannah talked about earlier with technology. So
thank you, Wes. All right, Peg, I see you have your hand up, so I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Okay, thank you. It's not really a comment as much as a question, but I wonder what the long-term effect of police now wearing the body cams will ultimately have on, you know, brutality and targeting individuals and all of that. Because just like Wes said, you know, you can edit things down. I'm not saying I don't know if police would really edit things down, but I mean, who knows what could happen? Maybe they already might be. And we might just not know that yet, or the extent of it yet. But, you know, I think that's also something to be taken into consideration, that you have witnesses taking, capturing real-time action, but then you also have police body cams capturing action too. So I wonder long term, how will that all kind of play out and come together?
Yeah, and I actually have seen instances where so the mandatory body cams is one of the many reforms that activists are pushing for, more police departments across the country to enforce mandatory police body cams and also mandatory dash cams on their cars. But even with that, I have seen multiple cases where, you know, the body cams were turned off, so an incident would happen and there was no footage, and or the department itself would take, you know, several days, weeks to release the footage. Yeah. So Angela made the the great point here, that the police in the story were specifically making sure that they were saying "stop resisting" repeatedly, so that they could feel that they had grounds for the abuse of Wilbur Robinson. So even with that, they're finding ways to work around and work within these systems. Yep. All righty. Any other comments before we move on to the next question? Okay.
Yeah, I'll be polite in using my hand this time instead of just jumping in. I thought that was a really, you know, within the story itself, you know, the author gave the American Eagle the superpower to see through walls, to hear conversations that other people might not hear. You know, so even with those superpowers, it didn't seem to matter. You know, and you know, that might be a comment. And you know, there was all sorts of, you know, there were references to, you know, the closed circuit television cameras and things like that. I think it just I think we can use these things, but they're not a panacea for the actual problem, and we can't have them be a crutch that we're so dependent on that it becomes counterproductive.
That's a really good point there. Yeah. Yeah, because ultimately the body cams are to try to catch something after it's happened. The ideal state is to prevent it from happening in the first place. Alrighty, any other thoughts? Alrighty, so our next question. So Wilbur Robinson says to the American Eagle that whiteness is a thing that other people choose for you. People are white if whiteness is endowed upon them. What whiteness gives, it can take away. Even that line just really blew me away. How do you define whiteness? What are some of the conditions of whiteness? And under what circumstances is whiteness revoked? I guess under what circumstances are whiteness revoked? I'll have to fix that typo. You should have caught that, Wes. You're a teacher. You should have read my notes and proofread my notes.
Oops, I'm off duty.
On summer break. Gotcha. Yeah. Yep. Any thoughts on that? Anyone want to specifically answer any of those questions? How you define whiteness?
Let me go on now. Start. I'll raise my hand.
You can go ahead.
Okay. I'm reading as we're going along because I got the book. I got the novella late, so I'm trying to catch up and understand the context and what in which this question comes from. Because I don't think about whiteness in terms of myself. I only think about whiteness in terms of white people. And I only think of that in terms of white privilege. And that's the only way I describe whiteness. Because like, for me, I have a phrase that I use. I call it the straight hair club. So when you talk about the caste system, it starts at top with white hair, white face, blonde hair, blue eyes, and then you just go down and you look at the features and you look at the hair and you look at all these things. And so, like you say, that proximity to whiteness. So if you are just like, before you get to Black people, just Black people in Africa, the Ethiopians are like on the top because they have straight hair and keen features. And so they look more like white people. And so they don't look like other Africans, and people always point to the Ethiopians and then they talk about the rest of West Africa like it's void of some type. But I just think whiteness is privilege. It's just privilege. And it was odd to me when you were talking about being safe. To me, it just sounds like assimilation and code switching. That's all it is, which is something that I always refuse to do, no matter what. I am Black and you deal with it. I am not changing to gain your acceptance because I don't need your approval to live my life. The atrocities that perpetrated and unfairness that comes my way because of my race, I didn't bring this on myself. It has nothing to do with me. That's all on you. I'm not the one who needs to change. You're the one who needs to change. Doesn't have anything to do with me. And so I'm not going to try to take on any whiteness because I don't want to be white. I'm happy like I am. So, I think everybody should be what they are. My father lived on the reservation until he was 19. And it wasn't easy, but he never wanted to not be Native American. Yeah. He never wanted to not be that.
Gotcha. Yeah, thank you for sharing, Hannah. We really appreciate that. And that's, yeah, a really important perspective, like you said, about assimilating and code switching. That's basically, yeah, exactly what that is. And that plays into it and what those terms mean. Yeah. And Amal, you wanted to add a comment there?
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, some of it, this quote, this part of the story, again, really struck home with me. And it's not about, what people necessarily want to be, like wanting to be white. It's about this notion of whether or not somebody is going to accept you, just accept you, period. Accept you as you are, or accept you within the fold. Whether some people don't want to be in the fold, that's fine, but it's this notion of accepting, and you can be accepted. And I think what he was saying is, you can be accepted, but you can easily be unaccepted. And I'm going to unload a little bit, because what this part of the story really reminded me of is, I grew up in a rural area in upstate New York, Arab American family, farming community. Not a lot of Arab Americans in the farming community, not a lot of, anybody, with like a multi-syllable name, in that community. And we were accepted in part because we lived in a big house. And, I think that was, we were pretty good in school and stuff like that. But, there was, you couldn't deny that every now and then there was a little undertone. And of my siblings, I was the one with the Arab name, which was different. And it wasn't, I mean, I have no complaints or anything. There were just a few incidents here or there. But then the Iranian hostage crisis occurred. And immediately Arab Americans, well, first, you have the oil, the wealthy Arabs in the Middle East and all the oil and stuff like that. But when the Iranian hostage crisis occurred in the late 70s, my mom told me that somebody within the town had come to her, and she basically said, if you hear anything about people talking in town, it's just talk. Basically, a friend of hers was essentially saying, some people were saying, well, who are these people and what should we do about them, et cetera, et cetera. And that whole notion of whiteness being a thing that could be taken away, our acceptance being taken away for something, because of how we looked or a community that we belong to. It's there, and it's still something that I consider quite fragile, for any minority community. And it's in this country, and especially, having gone through some of the things we went through in the past administration, and the Muslim ban and things like that, and September 11th. But more than anything else, that bit in the story just hit home for me, and it made me. I mean, everybody feels like an other at some point. You just have to be in a situation in which you actually are a minority. Everybody feels like an other at some point, but for some communities, it's more constant. And I felt like I could relate to it a little bit more when I saw that quote. So I'm really glad that you put that question in. I've been waiting for it, Robin. I let other people. I raised my hand, but I told you I was going to unload it.
Thank you for sharing that powerful story. Really appreciate it. And Peg, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Thanks again, Robin. Along with this larger quote that we're looking at, there is this one sentence, and it just, the whole paragraph of that quote kind of jumped out at me, and I said, this more than anything else in the story is probably the defining moment of this story, because that whole paragraph and quote was very poignant. But there is the sentence there that says, it starts before birth and carries on after you're dead. And again, the ultimate irony. People are born into what they're born into, and it's kind of like, it seems a little hopeless, like the cycle will just continue after any of us move on to the next life, after any of us pass away. What will have changed in the world? Or are we kind of just, reinventing and holding up different lenses to ourselves, and instead of evolving and moving closer together, those lenses are serving to pull us, I think, further apart and polarize us to the point where once everything gets polarized, something's going to break. And I really very much appreciated that paragraph to what it lent the entire story.
Thank you for sharing, Peg. Anyone else have any thoughts? Susie added in the comments that it means if you don't adhere to white norms that you can be shunned. And I really agree with that. That's kind of what I thought about specifically when Wilbur says, what whiteness gives, it can take away. So if you don't adhere, even as a white person, if you don't adhere to the norms of what most of society has determined you should be doing as a white person, that you can be shunned. It made me think of how like abolitionists were called N-word lovers, during Jim Crow, white activists were called N-word lovers. If you were in an interracial marriage, you were called a race traitor, things like that, how they would basically try to deny your white privilege. Yeah. So Grant, I see you have your hand up. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Yeah, those are great examples. I was thinking of, like the No Irish Need Apply, and Italian Americans being basically accepted into whiteness, maybe like World War I, World War II, I think, after that like communal effort. And I think people raise that as one of the kind of leveling playing fields, but for like a draft or enforced service. And the desegregation of the military was a pretty big step prior to the civil rights movement. So yeah, that's just my thoughts on it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Grant. Appreciate that. Anyone else have any thoughts that they want to share? I see that Hannah put in the comments, the problem for Black people, or the problem is that Black people, we've never been accepted, so there's nothing to be taken away. And that actually reminds me of some study, well, two things. One, some studies that were done talking about, the social structure and how even white people who are disadvantaged economically still consider themselves to be better than any Black person. So within regards of the racial caste system, it is this structure with whites at the top and blacks at the bottom, and then people moving back and forth throughout there, and depending on how you adhere to certain societal norms will either move you up or down a specific rung on that ladder. But certain elements, like to Hannah's point, our blackness can never be taken away. So regardless of what we do in terms of like code switching, assimilation, other things like that, we're always going to be on the bottom of that scale. And Wes, I saw you had your hand up. Did you have a comment?
I was going to say something very similar to that. Even within the societal structure of whiteness, there is a ladder within whiteness. And even though you can, do things that don't fit a norm, at the end of the day, by being granted whiteness, you may lose some privilege within that, but you will never lose that ultimate privilege of whiteness, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking of. Yeah.
You always will benefit it. Maybe not to the same degree as someone else with whiteness, but it will always be a token of privilege within society. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a quote, and I can't remember it specifically. It was said by a political leader, I think maybe a president or something. And if someone remembers this, please tell me who said it. But basically they said that if you always keep a poor white man looking towards Black people, he won't notice that you're picking his pockets. It was something along the lines of that, and I can't remember who said it.
Grant got it. It was Lyndon Johnson.
Okay. Okay.
And it actually came up in one of the other books that we read. I think it was Kill Switch.
Okay.
And where there's a big discussion of Johnson, and he was pointing it. I mean, in that context, he seemed to be pointing it out as a fact, during this period where he was actually trying to change the Democratic Party. But it was that was an eye opener. For anybody who hasn't read that book, we highly recommend it too. Yeah, so.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to go back and read that one. That one was before I joined the club. Before I joined the book club. Yeah. Any other thoughts before we move on to the next question?
Grant says, raising it as a bug or a feature? I don't get that.
Me neither. Would you mind expounding on that, Grant, for us? If you don't feel comfortable, that's totally fine.
Yeah.
Okay. Alrighty, so we'll go ahead and move on to the next question. So Bruce tells Eagle, you can't win this. You can't just stand between him and what the system is going to do to him. So are the Eagle's efforts really futile? What are some other ways that he can make a difference besides punching racism in the face? I'm sorry, that was kind of amusing to me when he said that, but yeah. Any thoughts there, folks? I think for me, when that interaction happened and what Bruce was trying to get Eagle, it's weird to call him Bruce and then the other one Eagle instead of just Clark. But I think the ultimate point that he was trying to make, was going back to that, as long as you stand in line, you will always be on the side, of goodness. But even with all of his power, it's so embedded and so systemic that it has to change with our American ideology, our thought processes, the way we inherently move through society, the way we talk to each other and the way we talk about each other, the way we absorb information, the types of information that we choose to share and to teach with each other, whom we idolize, what we idolize, you know, those are the types of things I feel are what is going to have to actually change our society. Because regardless of how much power a single individual has, you know, it is countrywide, it is societally, you know, something that we have to do together. But on the flip side of that as well, I do think that people with power, people in positions of power, do have to stand up and push back against the system. I think what Eagle came up against was his assumption, and this was also kind of, you know, his own form of white privilege, was him thinking that, oh, I'm the eagle, people are just going to fall in line and listen to what I have to say, you know, as opposed to really trying to understand how embedded racism is into just American culture, that, you know, you can't just decide one day that you want to push back on something because you think it's bad. You know, you have to actually use your power and platform in a way that causes a shift in the way that we think about each other and the way we talk about each other, as opposed to, you know, a fear almost. It's almost kind of like, you know, his response to things was, I will use my might. And in this instance, you know, that wasn't going to be enough. You can't fear someone into loving their neighbor. Well, that's my soapbox about it. Anybody else got any thoughts? All right, so Peg put in the comments, knowing that the ego has longevity, could it be that our idea of inequality has changed over hundreds of years? Hannah's 427 years point was saving the day good enough at one point, but is now a larger societal issue? I think that is a great question, an awesome question. If anyone wants to tackle that, because I've talked quite a bit, so I'll let someone else talk. I have thoughts that I will share after these commercial messages. Anyone else?
I'll raise my hand. Hold on. So, you know, I do, you know, that was, I had a mixed reaction to that. You know, with the fact that the American eagle had been around through other atrocities. Yeah, and you know, with questions like, well, where were you then? You know, what did you do then? You know, just the whole notion of justice. Justice, you know, we have justice. We have, you know, we have our laws. I mean, to me, on the one hand, it's unfortunate that things take so long, that it's never fast enough. And, you know, we're talking hundreds of years to correct things. And at the same time, well, in the very story itself, the American eagle kind of didn't do anything, in the earlier stages. That doesn't mean that he is discredited from trying to do something now. And it also means that he's not discredited ideally if right now isn't the time where everything gets fixed. I tend to be an optimistic person generally, and think that it's very frustrating, but progress does get made. It's so incremental. It's incredibly frustrating. But I thought that there was an element of that in the story by making reference to the fact that, yes, things have been around for hundreds of years, but we may be seeing things a little bit differently now than we did before.
So I have two thoughts on that, but I'm going to let somebody else speak first if they would like to speak first. All right. Well,
Go ahead.
oh, go ahead, Wes.
Well, all I was going to say in answer to Peg's, my thought was the hard part, because when Robinson and Eagle are talking, Robinson says, I'm not an act of contrition, I'm a human being, and this is my life.
Yes.
And so when I think of that, to Peg's question, no, it's like, it is harmful. The progress, while good, it's not good enough, because lives are being dramatically affected by racism. And so it will never be quick enough. It never will be. It'll never be good enough. But I agree with what you said, Jamel. And then I think too, when we look at it, as progressives and Democrats, this conversation is a huge piece, because from an activist perspective, it has to be quicker. It needs to be quicker. From a, maybe an elected official's perspective, well, how things get done, it's not always quick. It's slow, as we can see. But then it made me think at the very end, where it says some things America would tolerate, but other things it would never, ever forgive. And so how Eagle obviously was not liked by the right, the racist, but also was not liked by the activist, and so that very line, well, it wasn't said in my interpretation, and there were elements in the story of how Eagle was not liked by both sides, if you will, and so I don't know, that's just where my question was going and what my thoughts. And so Eagle was needing forgiveness from the right and how they were pissed off from everything he was doing, but then also from the other side, who felt like he was just using his white privilege to come in and save the day. So that's where my mind went.
Yeah, I went somewhere similar, Wes, because Jamel, your points are 100% valid, and for every activist that stands up, the day that they make that realization is an important day, and I never want to take that progress from them. But at the same time, we have to be careful in how much credit we attribute to that, because at the same time, people's livelihoods are still being affected. People's, abilities to receive an education, people's life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness depends on other people's abilities to observe and understand the impacts of these injustices. So we definitely want to give people time to figure these things out and figure out where they are, but we're still dying. We're still waiting for that home loan. We're still waiting for that bail for people to get out of jail. We're still waiting for Black mothers to be able to safely give birth within the healthcare system. You know, so I completely understand, you know, when people make that realization, but at the same time, the impacts of the lack of that are devastating to those people who are waiting, you know. And then the second point to what you were saying about how our society has changed over 100 years and like societal norms. I really want people, when they start talking about history, to start talking about the people in history that pushed back, you know, because like during slavery, there were white abolitionists. There was a William Lloyd Garrison, you know, Frederick Douglass went to Europe because white abolitionists put together and said, this isn't right, and paid his way. Why as a modern society do we focus on the fact that, oh, this was just normal? There were people then who said this is not okay. So why are we today making excuses for society when people who lived back then said it wasn't right? There were white activists during Jim Crow who gave their lives for this. So why are we in 2022 saying that's just how society was, when there were people in 1950, in 1960, who said that that was not okay? So 60 years in the future, we should not be still saying that that was okay. I'm sorry, more soapbox. I will step off and let Lori speak. Lori, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Hi, thanks. So I have so many thoughts about this. I've been having a hard time commenting, but I think what I want to say first of all is I think that the term whiteness bothers me because I think it allows white people to make themselves the victim when things change. I think it's more an issue of privilege. And then Robin, what you were saying that, you know, we have to change society. I think it's white people have to change the way they're looking at things. So I think the point I want to make is the line that I took a lot from in the book. I think it was Bruce asked Eagle when they were talking about him just stepping in and trying to save the day. Bruce asked him if he asked Wilbert Robinson what he needed from him, instead of just jumping in and doing what he thought was right, what he thought this model minority needed. He should have asked what was needed. And I think that's something that we need to ask ourselves instead of jumping in and defining what the model minority is and defining everything. We need to ask more questions. And I think that's where I want to stop because I can go off forever if I try to keep going.
No, I think that is the perfect point. You know, it's something that I think about a lot too, where, you know, as we are moving forward, you know, with trying to make racial progress, there are still a lot of white people taking the lead. And it's like, are we asking people who are being marginalized what they feel like needs to happen? We were talked about this last week too, like what voices are being in the room, are being led in the room? Who is leading these conversations? People who were of the dominant group should not be answering the question of what the oppressed group needs. All right, I'm just gonna read some of these comments here, if that's okay. So Hannah said that she is terrified about her grandson driving, holding her breath until she hears from him or her daughter. These are not intellectual considerations. These are real fears. 100% perfectly said. I agree with that. So yeah, also listens, many Black and brown voices are already saying what is needed. Yeah, 100% Wes. That's another thing. There are a lot of, there's a lot of work being repeated because there are Black and brown activists who have already done the work and have been doing the work for decades. But even as we move into equity work, we're still not listening to them. Anyone else have any thoughts or want to share anything? That's a great point, Hannah. People have to care about what you want in order to hear you. And that's why we're here, right? So that we can learn about each other and learn to care about each other. Yeah. So Peg, I see you have your hand up. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
So I wanted to ask Robin, do you think that people disregarding the work of those who came before us here at this time right now in 22, do you think that that is being politicized, so that the history, the trials of the struggles is somehow being minimalized by some political individuals or political groups of individuals? In that sense, I would say parties, but I don't mean necessarily political parties, but maybe that is the case.
That's a great question, Peg, and I would love to hear some other people's thoughts on that as well, aside from my own.
Absolutely, it is being whitewashed. My personal opinion.
Yeah, I'm with you there as well, Wes. I feel like I don't know if it's a specifically American trait, but we kind of like lionize these historical figures and we say that we should, emulate them. And I feel like there's a certain segment of the population that benefits from, if not the specific overt racism of the 1920s, 30s, 40s through Jim Crow, they still benefit from the racial caste system that we have in place. They still benefit from a social hierarchy. So if we were to learn our history and then begin to not just understand that other people were pushing back, understand, the work that had been done and how much ground we have lost, people who understand that there are people that they themselves can relate to within history who pushed back against that, then those people today, with understanding that context, would then potentially start to question our own societal structure to say, like, hey, is this really right? Is this, the society that we want for ourselves? Because learning about that history and learning about those stories, you get to understand how much of today is still reflected in the past. So if we start to actually learn about the past and learn about how that through line connects from then to today, I feel like more people would want to make a change and want to make a difference. And I feel like that is part of the reason why there is such a pushback against teaching certain concepts in schools. I feel like that's part of the reason that, critical race theory has been used as a buzzword to try to stifle any type of understanding of our recent American history. Because if we really understood that, I think we may not be where we need to be, but I feel like some of this work would be a lot easier if people had a stronger context of the history of this country. That's just my personal opinion. Anyone else have any thoughts to Peg's question? Hannah, I see your hands up. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Okay. I think there's a lot of change that needs to be made on both sides. Because all of this, that phrase, the South will rise again, they meant that when they said it. And so we all got lulled into a false sense of security in the 60s and the 70s because Blacks thought they had overcome something and they had not really overcome anything, not really. And liberal whites thought, oh, well, we've conquered this, Black people have jobs, they're moving into the suburbs. And so America now has racial equality. But in the background, there were people of that the South will rise again mentality who were plotting and planning. And the first dog whistle was when white males started screaming reverse discrimination. That's when it started. I was a in corporate middle management. And so I was dealing with angry white men who had been sitting at the top. And just because I promoted a couple of Black guys, they were all over me, and this was reverse discrimination. And so I knew then that we were in trouble. And I started pointing it out to people then that there was a wave coming, the second wave. So that's when it started, and they've been building on it. And when Barack Obama was elected president of the United States, that was a flashpoint. And the people who never wanted a Black man in what I have come to call the white folks' house, they accelerated what they were doing. So that's why we're here now. That combined with the declining white population, because white women decided to go back into the workforce, because Black women have always been working. So I never did understand the feminist movement. We want to go to work. The first Black woman that ever set foot in this country went to work in a cotton field. So we've always had the right to work. So that's a bunch of garbage. All of this, like the Supreme Court decisions about Roe v. Wade, that has nothing really to do with Black women. They say Black women will be hurt the most by it because they want to generate a lot of activity around it. But do you really think that people who pass laws to prevent us from voting, who pass laws that put our kids in a pipeline to prison, people who juries let police officers go free who murder unarmed Black men, you really think they are upset if we decide that we're going to have an abortion and not bring another Black child into this world? No, they want white women to have babies and keep their numbers up, because Hispanics and Asians, their numbers are growing in America. The birth rate among Blacks is declining. It is declining. So all of this is just for whites to remain in power, the white power structure to stay there. As far as when you said keep teaching history, all of the kids in our family were homeschooled, or they did a mix of homeschool and private education, because we weren't going to turn our most valuable asset over to people who hate us and who seek our annihilation. And because we did that, we had an opportunity to teach our kids their history and the history of this country. So more parents, Black parents, white parents, if they really want to change this society, they're going to have to take their kids in hand. They can't rely on the schools. They can't rely on politicians. Parents are going to have to become responsible for what their children learn and how their children perceive other people in this world. That's what we've done in our family. And I think it's made a difference. My grandson is he'll turn 18 next month. And he believes in diversity. He knows who he is and he's comfortable with who he is. And therefore, he's comfortable with other people and he can't be othered. Eleanor Roosevelt said, people can only do to you what you allow them to do to you.
Yeah, that is very, very good points all around, Hannah. Thank you so much for sharing.
Off my soapbox.
No, you made some excellent points there. As you were saying, you taught your children. I wasn't raised in a family where we could afford to send me to private school. And I think that's probably true for a lot of Black and brown kids. But I was incredibly fortunate that because my dad had lived through the civil rights movement. He came of age during that time. He was born in 1952, so he was 13 when the Civil Rights Act was passed. A lot of those things about integrating the schools, those happened directly to him. So I got to learn about that history because he taught it to me. And so, you know, understanding the importance of that and being able to look back and say, something isn't right here, something is missing in this story that I'm being told, was probably one of the most important things that my father was able to give to me. And I think that that is one of the reasons why there's such a strong attack on public education, is because they want to take away people's ability to say there's something missing in this story because they don't know the original story to begin with. All righty, any other thoughts before we ask the last question? It's getting close to 10 East Coast time, and I'm gonna ask the last question and then wrap up. All righty, so final question. What are next steps to meaningful police reform across the United States? And how do we help communities feel safe both with and from police forces? Anyone have any ideas? Any thoughts? Jamel, you have your hand up?
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah, have more people read the book. That this is just, I mean, this a couple of times this has come up, where change is really through understanding and finding more opportunities for people to put the effort into understanding. And even within the police force as well. We talk about education for cops and things, and reform and programs. And I do think that that's stuff that is important. And again, trying to figure out ways in which people can, somebody said you need to be able to hear people, figuring out more opportunities where people can actually hear each other. So I'm a big believer in that.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? I kind of feel like this needs to be a two-pronged approach, that there need to be some very basic minimum federal guidelines for every police force across the country, mandatory bias training, mandatory body cams, mandatory reviews and questions of excessive force, things like that need to be just standard across the board. And then the second prong really probably should be community-based. There are some examples in the reader's guide of different communities enacting very specific community-based changes, because every community is different. Every community has different needs. Communities' demographics are different. There are a lot of organizations that have ideas, and certain communities can apply those, as what fits to them. Some of the things that have been talked about are, crisis intervention teams, as opposed to sending police out for every situation. That there are statistics that show that like between 40 and 60% of police calls, somewhere in there, I can't remember the exact number, are for nonviolent encounters, are for mental health crises, are for situations where the event has already occurred and is over. So why do you need an armed person on the scene? There are people who are trying to create community forums where, police have direct contact and engagement with community leaders to understand, how can they change their policing methods. So I think at a community level, those are the types of things that individual communities can apply in ways that are most impactful for them. Anybody else have any thoughts?
I put Campaign Zero because I was trying to remember the two organizations. I know Campaign Zero has received some pushback within certain communities, but can anyone think there's another platform that kind of came out?
Defund the police? You talking about that one?
Say it again.
Defund the police?
Maybe I can't remember. Like I can see their website, but I can't think of their name. But because Campaign Zero kind of has like their little specific action steps to take, and this other and I'm trying to find it, but a lot of the Campaign Zero and this other organization both are putting forward some of those tangible steps that you did mention, Robin. So I'm going to try to dig real quick.
Okay, yeah, if you can find that, we can put that in the follow-up notes. I think we have Campaign Zero in the Reader's Guide, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, we do. Okay, we have that that website there for people to access. Anyone else have any other general thoughts about the story? Anything, just general ideas that you wanted to share? Anything about the story, about the topic, about police reform, about identity?
I just found the name of the other group. 8 Can't Wait.
Oh, I have heard of them. Okay, yep. I have heard of that one.
Put that in the chat too.
Yeah. Do you remember why Campaign Zero got pushback?
Essentially, it was kind of, just as I was speaking earlier, there were kind of that divide within, what steps to take. Campaign Zero is more from a reform standpoint, which, you reform a system and so that system still exists, just with changes. Whereas from my understanding, 8 Can't Wait is more coming from it from an abolitionist perspective. So
Gotcha. Okay.
the system, and probably direct abolition directly to community policing.
Gotcha.
That's my understanding. So
yeah, there is a lot of debate around, some actions people think go too far, other actions people think don't go far enough. Yeah. Alrighty, well, if no one has anything else to share, we will go ahead, Wes, if you don't mind taking us back to the presentation. I'm gonna talk about next week's book really quick. Alrighty, so next week's story is it correct to call it the titular story since it's also called Radicalized? But that's the name of it. The next week's short story is called Radicalized, and one of the primary topics is healthcare. So it follows a man whose wife has been diagnosed with cancer that is potentially treatable. So we're going to be talking a lot about the healthcare system next week. We will send out the reader's guide ahead of time so you guys can take a look at the questions that we will be asking. But we do want to warn you, there is very strong language in this story. And also there are graphic depictions of bombings of occupied buildings. There's a lot of discussion of suicidal thoughts and depictions of suicide by bombing. So if any of that is potentially triggering for you in any way, please make sure you take care of yourself. And again, just to reiterate, as Wes always says, you do not have to read the story to participate in the discussion. Just as we talked tonight, we understand that the beating happened, but we're not going to talk about like specifically the details of what happened. We're going to focus on the impact of our healthcare system, the impact of insurance, so you can still participate in the discussion, even if you choose not to read the story.